have uh, Giles Gravier. I hope I pronounced the name right. I don't speak French, so I apologize if the pronunciation is not perfect. I did my homework on that, though. I'll introduce Mr. Giles. He's a director and senior open source strategy advisor in Wipro Open Source Program Office, based in Geneva, Switzerland. He provides open source and blockchain strategy consulting and advising services to Wipro key customers worldwide. He has a pragmatic approach to open source and regularly advises global companies, startups, and venture capitalists on open source strategies, licensing issues, and business models. During his career, Giles has always been involved in both security and open source, particularly in roles such as Chief Technology Strategist for Security and Open Source at Sun Microsystems, advising the largest accounts globally on their IT security strategy, as well as their open source activities. He moved on to develop the global market and business development strategies for open source and security in the public sector, still at Sun, and then Oracle. He has been active as a technology evangelist, in particular for these companies around cryptography, DRM, open source, and open standards. Dr. Giles' presentation today will be about open source at the core of everything digital. The floor is yours. Please share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfectly.
perfect. Thank you. So thank you for the nice words. And unfortunately for the French part of it, it's hard for everybody. But you should see me trying to speak Arabic. It's even worse. So my name is Gilles Gravier. I work for a company called Wipro. We're a global system integrator. I'm based out of Geneva in Switzerland. And just a little bit about Wipro, and then I'll switch to pure open source stuff. But we're actually super present in the open source world. We're members of a whole bunch of different organizations at different levels. I have listed here a few of them, but I will talk more about open source foundations and organizations a little later in my session. So I want to talk a little bit about open source in the digital world. And so I'll talk about where is open source today. It's everywhere. That's a hint. I will talk about open source and how it helps in the digital age. And then I'll talk a little bit about how open source and communities can work together, and maybe give you a few hints as what to do next. Now, as a really nice thing, Ms. Mehabi's presentation before introduced a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about. So I won't have to justify things. She's justified them already. So thank you. I really appreciated the presentation before. So, and by the way, the picture I have here was taken in 2019 when I was at FOSS conference at Sultan Qaboos University as well. So I can't wait for the next time I'm actually in Oman again to talk with all of you. So first of all, let's look a little bit at the open source market. In the open source world, things move really fast. If you remember, for those of you who, like me, have gray hair or gray beards, or no beards, but gray hair anyway. In the 1960s, 70s, there was this concept of free software that was invented by some people in universities. And while at the origin, it was more of a philosophical idea, it turned in the 90s into something that is an enterprise concept called open source. Before that, it was called free software, free as in freedom. And what happened is that progressively it grew to penetrate a lot of the industry sectors, and we'll be talking about which industry sectors it has penetrated in the next slide. But What I wanted to mention here is that open source has been growing always and is today really mainstream. If you look, 95% of organizations actually leverage open source today. 94% of IT executives that are asked about open source and what they think about open source basically tell us open source is equal to or better than proprietary software, and that's super interesting metric. It shows that open source has really stepped into the world of enterprise and is accepted standard as a standard type of software. It's growing at a 24% rate. The open source services market, that's where Wipro is, so that's the number we tend to quote, is growing at a rate of 24% per year. There's not many things that grow so fast. And not only the market, but communities. Communities are groups of people who participate in open source projects. I've put in some statistics from GitHub's Octoverse report. The Octoverse report is something that GitHub runs every year or so. And GitHub, for those of you who still don't know what GitHub is one of the most popular platforms for sharing open source code and developing in a distributed manner. So, open source, GitHub has more than 73 million developers. And to be honest, Oman is not really present. There are a few Omani developers, but in general, in the Gulf countries, the presence is not that strong, something that needs to be changed. 84% of Fortune 100 companies use GitHub Enterprise. GitHub Enterprise actually lets companies put code on GitHub and not necessarily share it to the public. Then what they do is they use the same kind of methods as open source, but they use that to develop internally or in a private repository. That's called inner source, and it's becoming a key trend in software development. It's basically using all of the open source methodologies, best practices, models, but not sharing the code with the rest of the world, because honestly, sometimes you don't really want to share it. It's not always, but if your IP is in your open source, is in your software, then of course that's something you don't want to share. Now, most organizations realize that a lot of their software that they're developing isn't IP, it's just general tools, and those can benefit everybody. And by the way, when they benefit your competition, then it creates a common base that everybody can use. So it's actually pretty good. Figure out some code that can be shared with your competition is a great way to grow your market and everybody's activity in the last 12 months, 61 million repository. A repository is if you want, it's a directory where people store a project's code. So 61 million projects created on GitHub in the last 12 months. That's a huge number. I mean, it's like every day, boom, thousands pop up, literally 6,000 pop up per every day. What we find though, and that's important, is that a lot of organizations still are trying to figure out the governance model for their open source usage or their inner source usage. So there's still things to fix, even though, as you can see, it's growing significantly. And more and more companies actually are contributing to open source projects, are open sourcing their software and sharing that with the community. We'll talk about why it's interesting to do that. But the fact that more and more are doing it is really interesting. It means that some of these projects, these repositories, were created by banks, telcos, airlines, and I'm saying these names because I've seen the exact examples, right? So it's really interesting. And if you want to look at this, around you, check which companies are growing quickly. Very often it's because they're using open source. I met a bank about 2 years ago, year and a half in Oman, that was telling me we don't have the big amount of money that the bigger banks have. So if we want to grow and leapfrog them, we actually have to develop in open source. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, and it'll let us be more innovative. So let's see a little bit more where open source is present in the enterprise world or everywhere else. So first of all, it's present in so many pieces of software that are either fully open source, like Linux, like LibreOffice. I'm sure you use these, Kubernetes, all around in the telco space. It's basically everywhere. But interestingly, Synopsys did a survey on proprietary software. Well, they did a survey on open source, but it includes proprietary software. And they find that 98% of the code they surveyed, this, I think over 1,500 projects they surveyed, 98% of those projects, proprietary projects, contain open source. 75% of them were composed only of open source. So if looking at a whole bunch of very common applications out there, the open source is everywhere. And it's interesting because in 2016, when they did that same survey, they actually distinguished open source from proprietary software, in particular in terms of code quality, and they found that both were very close. And in future surveys, they've stopped distinguishing that because almost all proprietary software includes open source. So there's not much point in distinguishing proprietary from open source in terms of, is open source in there? It is, always, or almost always. It's present in hardware, you know, and that's interesting because Ms. Merhabi's presentation mentioned that we could see, you know, equipment, measuring equipment, we could see robots being built, something like that. Hardware, a lot of hardware, almost all hardware includes open source at some point. Medical equipment has open source, multimedia equipment. And then the fun thing is that it's not just in the software space, not just in the IT space. You can find open source schematics for houses, open source recipes for food, recipes because people are sharing actually these recipes and allowing people to modify them in an open source spirit. I seem to have duplicated 2 lines too. That's I didn't reread that part. Now, interestingly enough, in the same synopsis survey, they looked at which markets you could find open source. And so in the software that is being developed or used in aerospace and aviation, 70% is open source. Big data, 76%. I'm sure you can read the numbers, but it's huge. It's always over 50%. I think the lowest number is telecommunications and wireless, and even that is actually quite surprising because if you look at the 5G world, which is in huge development now, almost all of the key projects like LRAN are in open source. And that's what's going to drive the development of 5G and the next 6G project is open source sharing of code between vendors of equipment, of software, telcos, because that allows them to create standards and standards that actually fully interoperate. And today that is the key element. So I think, you know, I want to be really I really stress this point here that open source is literally everywhere in the world that we look. And, you know, this is something that I discussed with the people at, well, you can see the logo Mercedes, about a year ago. For me, I don't know if it's for the same thing for you, but for me, Mercedes was my dad's car. You know, this slightly aged, extremely reliable car that never breaks down, but boring to drive. And then when I said that to one of the guys at Daimler, he said, "Let me show you something." And he took me to this car, what is it? A Class C car, I think, a brand new one. And he showed me the dashboard, and he said, "You see what's in this dashboard? Well, everything you see in here is powered by open source. It's actually running on Linux, and you know, the rest is like a geek's dream, right? Yeah, high performance NVIDIA chips, multi GPU, multi CPU, multi cores, a lot of RAM, a huge amount of CPU power. But what was really fun is that this car is running Linux, and they're not the only ones, right? There was a story not too long ago, I think in 2015, about a BMW car for which some hacker figured out that that the software was Linux, and so they actually asked for access to the source code because if software includes Linux, because Linux comes under the GPL license, it's considered distribution because it's in your car, and the whole car is considered a project because it's an embedded device by itself. So the guy said, "I want all the source code." It went into the lawyer's hands, and finally, Mercedes actually decided to to agree and make the source code available. But which is another story. If we want to talk about licenses, we'll do that, and it'll take a few more hours. But the idea here is that cars are now being powered by open source, and in particular by Linux. So this is something that that is, for me, is symptomatic. Yeah, if you can put open source and Linux in something that has the capability, if not done well, to drive you off a cliff or into a wall, it means that Linux can be trusted, and it can be trusted to provide, you know, the kind of environment you expect in extremely reliable systems. So look around you. You know, next time you see an electronic device, and think about what's inside. Do you think it is open source? Do you think not? If you own a phone, for example, most of the operating system, even if it's iOS, which is built on how do you say it, an open source BSD core like Mac OS, and even more if it's Android, which is running on Linux. You know, it's open source in there, but it's going to be also everywhere. So it's there. And it's there to stay. So let's look a little bit more now about the digital age itself. And I've tried to create some kind of a definition, if you want, or more of a description of the digital age, because everybody has their own definition. So I'll just describe it. And I'll start by saying that it's a combination. It's today's world, but it's a combination of a world that has both physical and digital aspects that interface, whether it is people and machines, or machines and things like that. So it's evolved progressively. Mrs. Merhabi mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. It probably started there, maybe a little bit earlier, but it's what we also call the information age, right? Everything is based on information technology and actual information. The whole economy is based on that. And while a few years back that economy was turned from companies to users, it's slightly changing because internet has been now almost everywhere. People are connected from all kinds of devices, you know, desktop, laptop, handheld devices like their phones. Even now, there are 3D glasses like the Oculus devices, which are autonomous. They just have a Wi-Fi connection. And if you've read Neil Stephenson's book called Snow Crash, where he mentions metaverse for the first time, those glasses are very, very close to the device he used to describe in 1992 when he wrote the book, where people put their eyes in a device that projected an image on their retina. Well, yeah, that's an Oculus device today, and it lets people connect to the what in the 1990s was called the information superhighway, but is now today called the metaverse. And this metaverse is changing that economy-based, that information-based economy to an economy where the people actually drive the economy by enabling people not only to consume, but also to create and provide. So if you look at new metaverse models, people actually own their content, but actually monetize their content, and they do that, in a kind of a shared economy model between each other, and that is really changing. That is letting basically the world behave as a completely decentralized economy. It's going to be based on things like blockchains, or to be more generic, distributed ledger technologies. It's going to include a lot of IoT, whether it's because these devices provide connectivity, or provide services, or talk to each other. So think, in terms of interaction model, think business to business, companies interacting with each other through this kind of digital model, like digital supply chains, with proper mechanisms to ensure that everything is done transparently, probably using a blockchain. We also have business to consumers, where we're seeing now companies actually provide things like a metaverse environment for the consumer to interact with them when or before or after they purchase from the company. And finally, the consumer to consumer model. If you played with, there's a metaverse called UHive. People can post content, create their NFTs, and sell them and buy stuff in an economy that's based on a blockchain-based token. So the centralized organization actually doesn't exist anymore. The whole model is decentralized. And I understand that this is going to be a tricky step to negotiate for governments in particular, because, well, governments like to control things. It's their job. It's their job to make sure the citizens are going well and not doing things that mess up with everything. But in this digital age, it's becoming more and more complex to do that. And there's going to be a need to find other ways to, as a government, to interact with the citizen and possibly participate in this digital economy. Just to give an example on the UHive metaverse, comparing to, say, Facebook. UHive is basically a Facebook on the metaverse. Facebook has a centralized team that provides content control. If somebody posts something bad, the Facebook robots basically flag it and turn it off and notify the user. On UHive, it's actually a shared model where people can report things, and then it gets reviewed by a community that decides whether or not the content is bad or good. And so, if governments are involved, they should participate in these review communities and things like that. So new models need to be created. What's going to be interesting also in the digital age is 24/7 interaction. And that means you can't do it with people because people have to sleep. So even though they don't sleep at the same time. So we're going to see the appearance, for example, of artificial intelligence chatbots that provide first level of interaction with people. If you're using a product and you have a question, you will ask the question. You don't worry what time it is of the day. And the first answer you're going to get is probably from a chatbot that's going to speak more and more like a human, interact with you in a more and more precise way. I'm sure you've all experienced these chatbots where you ask a question and the answer is completely 90 degrees from what you asked, except for one keyword that the chatbot picked up. It's going to be this model is going to disappear progressively, and these chatbots are going to be more and more intelligent. So if you're in this business of AI, well, this is what you really want to look for. And of course, all of this is going to be focused on the user experience. Think multimedia, think 3D, AR, augmented reality, virtual reality, expanded reality, haptic feedback. And if you look at this, and if you remember my previous slide, actually all of this is either fully open source or built on open source. And if you look at the best libraries for doing machine learning, they're open source. The best blockchain platforms are open source. The IoT libraries out there are open source. So it's just going to be open source almost everywhere. Now, please note that I created this definition in 2022, and probably we'll see changes in a few years. And by that, I mean, in 5 years, you should expect to see more stuff in here. Some things will disappear, some things will change. Just a little word here, the 5-year horizon is really important. Beyond 5 years, it's hard to predict what usage patterns will come out of the technology we have today. We can see what technology will evolve and appear in 5 years, but what we don't know is what people will do with it. Like, who would have imagined in 2004 that people will be sending to each other images that would disappear after a few seconds? Yet Snapchat is here, and businesses are starting to use it. So, benefits of open source in the enterprise. And here I want to thank again Mrs. Merhabi, because one of the things she mentioned was innovation, and that is the first benefit of open source enterprise. Innovation, better innovation, faster innovation, either by using somebody else's innovative open source code, that's called secondary innovation, or by creating very innovative code, leveraging open source or possibly sharing it. The other benefit is fail fast. If you use open source, it's very easy to procure. You download it, you try it. If it doesn't work, you ditch it and you get something else. So cost is very low for failing, time is very low for failing, and the model to test is very, very easy. Zero-day productivity is actually a term that was coined by one of my customers to mimic the zero-day vulnerability in the security world. And he said to me, if we hire a developer to work on an open source product, well, if that developer has been using it previously, they're going to be immediately productive. So this is, you hire somebody to do work on open source, and they're instantly productive the day you hire them. You don't even have to train them. Developer centricity. If you work on open source, if you do open source, please communicate, and this is also the visibility part. Please communicate about this. It will help attract the best talent. It will help keep the best talents in your organization or in the country. That's why you may see the logo that I have next to me about the Open Source Center of Excellence. That's why we're actually doing this in Oman, to attract talent, to train talent, to make the country more open source interesting, if you want. So open source and communities. This is an example of some of the open source communities that Wipro is a member of. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm sure you recognize a lot of the logos. I want to point out one in the middle called To-Do. It's called the To-Do group. I would recommend, if you're trying to figure out how to work with open source communities, to go and have a look at what they're doing, because their role is the community side of open source, creating best practices, helping organizations create open source program offices and things like that. Have a look at To-Do group. They're a great group of people. If you're in financial services, have a look at Finos. If you're in the networking side, look at LF Networking. If you're in the oil and gas, look at OSDU, Open Subsurface Data Universe. There's bound to be something for you, regardless of what sector you're in. And if you don't find a community that works for you, you have my contact details at the end of this presentation. Email me, I will find one for you. When you work in an open source community, what do you get? Well, that's why I want you guys to listen to this. First of all, you'll learn about writing better code, because cleaner code, because they will give you guidelines, and if you don't follow the guidelines, they will scream at you and tell you, no, this is wrong. You need to do it this way. You have to be ready for that, because you'll get a lot of that at the beginning. But it's a great way to learn really fast and increase your competency. As a developer, it's a superb learning tool. It creates one of the best CVs you can have on the planet. Actually, if you contribute on things like GitHub, employers will actually look at your GitHub resume for that. Benchmark yourself against, and learn from the best coders on the planet. Again, sometimes it will be a little harsh in commenting, but it's a great way to measure yourself. It's a great way to follow a passion for improved technology. It's an opportunity to collaborate and learn from the smartest people. It's self-visibility and recognition, not just self actually, but also for an enterprise. Companies that contribute to open source project and talk about it are seen as great place to work, as contributors to society. It's a great way to see, to change, your organization's reputation. So, you want to do that this way. And also, when you're working on a project, that joins the 0-day productivity. When you're contributing to an open source project and you get hired to work on this, you're directly prepared to work on a project. So have a look at open source projects. And by the way, if you're a developer and you don't know where to start, or if you're even better, if you're not a developer and you don't know where to start, there's plenty of places you can actually contribute, right? It's not just writing code, but reporting bugs is a great way to contribute to an open source project. A good bug report that has details, explain how to reproduce, is marvelous for a developer. Localization. Most of you here are from the Arabic world. A lot of the projects in the open source community don't have good Arabic translations. So if you can, help in the localization. It doesn't require developer skills. It just requires editing text files skills and speaking the language. So, all projects have a localization team, or most of them do. You can request a feature. That helps the project move forward. This is actually a really interesting aspect of open source. The open source software doesn't tend to be bloated because it only has features that actually users want to use and need to use. So asking a feature that makes sense for you and explaining why is a great way to contribute. You can participate in community events. I organize Hyperledger meetups for the French-speaking community around the world and in Geneva. I'm not a coder for that. I'm just organizer. And of course, think each project is different. So whatever project you look at, they will have different ways of doing things. And some of them might be better suited for you and others actually might not. But I think regardless of your skills, there's something to do in every project for everybody. And that's something I want you to keep from this slide. And whatever you do in an open source project, you will get visibility for that. So since we're talking about this digital world, I have 15 more minutes, but I want to leave 5 for questions and answers. So I'll spend 10 minutes on these next 2 slides to help you with with next steps. If you're going to go into the digital world with your open source guns blazing, how do you do that? How do you make sure that your open source and digital road is a nicely paved road? So first of all, what you would need to do is check on your digital status, right? Today, as an organization, what developments are you engaged on or planning to engage on? Most companies are writing software for their internal use, and have a look at what you're already doing, right? Does that software involve open source code? Are you using open source libraries? Are you actually using full open source products for your development? Could some of the code you write for your project actually be published as open source? Remember what I said earlier. If your IP is software, you might not want to share that. But if the software you're writing is just things to help the organization, process stuff, run better, sharing it with your peers is a great way to show that you're a thought leader. And so you do that. It also helps innovate. There's a company called Allianz who actually took the time to rewrite 6 million lines of code of their insurance backbone software, and they published it as open source. And they're basically telling their competition, please participate in this, help make it better for us and you and everybody else, so that we all have a common base. And by the way, because we're publishing it, you can trust that what we're selling you, because they sell this software, you can trust that what we're selling you is actually what we tell you that we're selling. Now, the way this works is that each insurance company writes their own modules on top of the backend for their own specific services. But because they use the same common backend and they're all contributing to it, they all benefit from this technology that gets better and better. And they all offer compatible services. So one can have a service for their users to insure cars. Another one can insure, I don't know, houses. But these 2 pieces of software will have a common way of sharing, for example, interaction with a bank, because it uses the same backbone. So think about it on your site. What are you writing? Can it be shared? What will you benefit? What will you achieve with sharing open source software? So think about your open source strategy. If you want to do open source, and why are you planning to do this? Saving money? Probably you will, but if you have to do it really well. If you do it badly, you're actually going to spend more money with open source because of the additional work it requires. But if you're planning on innovating or benefiting from innovation, that's a great way. If you're planning on attracting talent, it's a great way. If you're planning on building trust, it's a perfect tool. Think about what you plan to achieve with your open source activities, and then build a strategy, a whole corporate strategy that supports it. And then, once you have a strategy, set a plan for doing this. List the softwares you're going to publish, when you're going to do that, where you're going to publish them, what licenses, what community models you want to have. It's really important. And by the way, the best place to have an open source strategy is as open source. A lot of companies are publishing at least the higher elements of their open source strategy. If you go to Société Générale's website, they basically said, our strategy for open source has 3 points: consume, contribute, attract. Consume is they use open source. Contribute is they publish open source, as well as they contribute to the open source projects they use. And attract is attract talent. And as an example for Attract, every time there's an open source conference where they're speaking, they go with an HR person that has job descriptions for people to hire and things like that. Disney does that. I was at a conference in the US a couple of years ago before COVID hit, called All Things Open, and Disney had a whole booth with 3 or 4 people from HR, had a whole wall of open job descriptions and things like that. They're just leveraging the fact that the best people are there. So make sure that your strategy includes everything you want to do, including HR, and get the HR people involved, of course, and then figure out who can help you. There's a whole bunch of companies, not just Wipro, that are really good at helping organizations set out on their open source road, create an open source program office, develop an open source strategy, an open source community engagement plan, things like that. So find out who can help you, because sometimes you think you know how to do it, but I've seen projects, open source projects actually fail because the company missed some critical steps, or not necessarily failed, but sometimes just, not be as successful as they were hoping it to be. So next step, find which open source projects to interact with as an organization. Don't contribute to projects just like that. You have to use projects that make sense for you. Project that you use, most likely, and that are important to your project. Why? Because contributing will require a little bit of extra work. And if you do that little bit of extra work on something that's unrelated to the company, at some point, it's going to be hard to justify. On the other hand, if you're using that software and you fix a bug, it's very easy to justify the interest of fixing a bug in the software. The first interest is you get it fixed way before everybody else. So if you have a bug and you have to wait for the vendor to fix the software, it's going to take ages. Or if you need an additional feature. I was working with the Japanese government in 2010, and they needed support for extended kanji, their alphabet, extended kanji in their Office suite. They asked Microsoft when they would get that in Office, and Microsoft said, yeah, you'll get it in the next release 2 years from now. At the time, it wasn't Office 365, so they had individual releases. So they said 2.5 years, you'll have it, and you'll have to migrate because not Office 365, so upgrade license. So there was a cost. And then they asked me, I was at Sun Microsystems, who owned Open Office, and I said, no, we won't do it for you. Sorry, guys. But what we can do is we can help you set the team to do it. So we helped them build a team with font experts, UI experts, UX experts. Nobody talked UX, but that was the same thing. C and C++ programmers, because that's what Open Office was written in. And they did it by themselves. They did it in 2.5 months with a team of about 10 people. So the cost for doing that was a lot less than actually, and the time was a lot less, 10 times less than having to wait for a commercial vendor. And then they contributed that code to the Open Office project. And the great thing about contributing the code is that they actually sent that code. And now, even though Open Office is mostly dead and people use LibreOffice, which is a fork of Open Office, well, LibreOffice has and maintains support for extended kanji for free for the Japanese government and for every Japanese user. I have a question here. What is the risk of using the same backend with Azure have access to its source code and they can find vulnerabilities into it? Well, let me tell you something. If you're using proprietary software, the bad guys already have the source code. They stole it, they bought it, they convinced somebody, they bribed somebody to get it. They have the source code. They will find vulnerabilities and they won't tell you about them. So they will use those vulnerabilities. Remember the Israeli company and their security software called, what is it, Pegasus, I think, something like that, that snoops on people's phones. They're using an undisclosed vulnerability in iOS. Well, if the OS was open source, probably somebody would have found it and fixed it. It's not that open source code is more secure, it's that remediation takes place faster because the code is visible by not only the bad guys, they always find ways, but also the good guys who also have a fair chance of finding and fixing it before. So with open source software, you get fixes faster, really, really faster. If we have time, I'll tell another story. But find open source projects to interact with and find how you can participate in the communities. I've given a few headlines, but To The Group is actually working on creating a new guide on how to interact with communities. So follow To The Group if you want to know more. But the best way to work with a community is first to start by lurking. Sign up to mailing list. Look at what people discuss. You probably will learn a lot there already. Maybe provide fixes or email questions, discuss things, and then of course provide translation. That's a great way to participate in the community. I've mentioned that. Of course, publish your own code, create a GitHub, put the code in a repository, choose a license, make it visible, make your communications, your publication visible, tweet about it, post on LinkedIn, you name it. Encourage your employees to identify themselves as employees of your organization so that your organization benefits from all the contributions they do, because it works really well. Communicate. I've mentioned it several times, so I'll mention it again. Communicate, use social media, use the communication tools that are available to you so that what you do is visible. It doesn't take a lot of extra effort. It brings a lot of extra benefits. Participate actively. Have a community manager that drives participation, that encourage your employees to post, to tweet, to discuss, to create events, to share their knowledge, everything. It's all about participation. And the more you participate, the more visibility you'll get, the more you'll be interesting for employees to join, the more you'll be showing your skills to your potential customers, etc. And finally, learn fast, and communities are a great way to learn fast. So as my last slide, actually, I want to encourage you to aim for Oman 2040, which has a lot of digital elements in there. That's the reason we created the Open Source Center of Excellence, and start doing that today. We're in 2022. We have 18 years to go forward to that Oman 2040, and start by doing open source, getting all digital, and that's a great way to move forward. Thank you. We have time for questions, so I'm going to open, or Shaham is going to open the bridge for everybody.
Okay.
If people
I
have
want
questions.
to make sure that you can hear me. Yeah.
I hear you fine, Shaham.
Oh yeah.
Now it works.
So your name is Gilles, not Giles, as I pronounce it.
Gilles. It's one of those tricky French names where you have to forget half of the letters.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this actually rich and interesting presentation. Actually, for a non-specialized person such as myself, I came from architectural engineering background. It changed my attitude toward open source.
Oh, thank you.
Seriously, it did. And I have a comment on this, but I prefer first to see if any other person has a question. There were one question which you answered already about the back access. Do we have any other question? Since we have a couple of minutes more, my point is that, Jules, I'm not a specialized person, and I feel that the open source community are close to each other. They don't come out to us non-specialized. I do research, and if I have funds, and I prefer to pay for licensed software as opposite to pay to someone to write an open source for me, because I feel, and maybe I'm incorrect on this, I feel that it's less secure, the open source is less secured, and if I need maintenance later, it will be more difficult. Mm-hmm. But what you presented now, actually it flipped the coin, the other side, and I still feel that you need to go out to people more and more. I know it's since 1990s, not new, but still people, non-specialized people who has the need for that, still maybe don't have that trust in the open source.
And you're very right. I mean, it's there's not enough advertisement about open source technologies. Everybody's using open source. Literally everybody today. There's no hiding that, but they don't know that, and that's the problem. So, people have Firefox or Thunderbird on their PC. They use VLC to view videos, and nobody tells them it's open source. They don't really realize. They see it as free. that they can download it freely, but nobody tells them that it's open source. So it's hard to actually generate this this visibility in a way that makes people aware of the fact that it's open source, and because it's open source, that they can participate, make it better, translate it, etc. I think the first time I participated in an open source project, I didn't really realize it was open source until I needed to make it better because of a translation issue. So, you know, I sent an email to the guy saying, by the way, your English translation, it was a French guy who was developing a software. And I said, your English translation really sucks. I can help you with that if you want. And he said, yeah, it's open source. Go there, get the file and just provide the correct translation. And I did that, you know, and then all of a sudden I had my name in the software. It's like, oh, cool. so nice. So people don't necessarily realize until they actually need to get involved. And that's something that's important from the visibility perspective. I have a question. Is there any educational open source that you recommend? Poof, so many things like the programming languages like Python to learn programming, using devices like Raspberry Pis or you know, is a great way to start programming. There's, as I mentioned, Firefox, Thunderbird, VLC to view media, Shotcut to edit videos if you're going to be doing presentations. I'm using OBS, which is a piece of software that is all open source that lets me, for example, set my background like, you know, like this, and change the look and feel of my screen. If you see my video here, which lets me put logos and maybe share a view from the city of Geneva when it's going to pop up, because it streams a webcam that's in Geneva, and it's very easy, and that's all open source software. So, you know, open source is everywhere, and it's just a question of I think if you Google, you know, your field of education, you'll find it. If you're looking for, you know, AI libraries, you'll find TensorFlow hiding somewhere. That's open source.
Thank you very much, Gilles, for the interesting presentation. I'm sure everyone benefited from that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me here, and I look forward to being here next time in person at Sultan Qaboos University. Hopefully. As you can see, my background picture here is from the Sultan Qaboos University when I was there in 2019 on my slide.
You are welcome always, Jim.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.